Okay, so for Chapter 9, the goals for learning are to explain the process Congress uses to admit new states, to describe the ways territories, commonwealths, and states differ, and to identify ways state governments are similar to federal governments because they are set up very similar, and then to explain how states raise money and spend money, and to identify branches of state government and describe their responsibilities. The Constitution went into effect in 1788, and at the time there were 13 countries. And then finally in 1959, Alaska and Hawaii became states, and now we're at 50 states, although we could grow to more states. Most states entered before 1900, and the United States Constitution gives Congress the power to admit new states. Over the years, Congress has acted 37 times to admit new states to the country, and some states were formed by dividing old states. For instance, Maine was once part of Massachusetts, if you look at the very top of our little map there. And what else? Texas was an independent republic before it joined the country in 1845. And then some states were formed from territory the United States bought or that the U.S. won in wars. We're going to go in and explaining what a territory is. So what is a territory? It's a region controlled by the United States government, and people in that territory cannot vote for the president and the vice president. And a few examples are the Virgin Islands, Guam, and America Samoa. They actually send elected representatives to the House of Representatives, but they are not represented in the Senate. A commonwealth, which is considered a political unit that rules itself, but freely chooses to be a part of a country, is an example. For instance, Puerto Rico and the Northern Mariana Islands are commonwealths. They receive money from the federal government. So you might be wondering, well, how does a territory become a state? Most states began as territories. When the people of a territory want to become a state, they apply to Congress, and then Congress agrees that the territory is ready to become a state, and they make a special act, and it's called the Enabling Act. Now, what is the Enabling Act? Well, it's when legislation makes a territory write a state constitution to prepare for what they call statehood. So the state has to write a constitution, and remember, the term constitution means what is the state going to be made up of? What is its ruling body going to be made up of? How is it going to govern its people? When the territory and Congress approve the new state constitution, the state is admitted into the United States. Some people in Puerto Rico are interested in statehood. If state territories and commonwealths become states, then their citizens would have equal rights. So that's something that the citizens want. But then again, some fear that they would lose their traditions if they joined the United States. For instance, in Puerto Rico, Spanish is their native language, and they would be afraid that they'd be forced to give up their native language to English. So that there's two opposing sides here. Freedom for people, equal rights, but then perhaps a fear of losing the traditions of their territory. For full credit, please answer the following questions to the best of your ability, and feel free to look at other slides prior. Under English rule, the original 13 colonies were ruled by what they call charters, which is a document that states a group's purpose and plan. So what is the state's purpose and plan? So this was before our independence from English rule. Charters were documents given by England, and they defined the purpose of the state. And after the Declaration of Independence was written, each colony wrote its own constitution. So later, each new state wrote its own constitution, and each state's government received its power from the Constitution, so that instead of following English rule, they followed their own constitution's rule. Now, are all state constitutions the same? They're very similar in most ways, and very similar to how the federal government is set up as well. They all have a preamble which explains how its state government is, it's the goals and purposes of the government. And most state constitutions contain 7 parts. So we start with the goals and purposes found in the preamble. And then the Bill of Rights, which lists the freedoms and rights given to each citizen, and good thing for that. There's organization of the government, so how are the 3 branches organized, and what are the duties, who's going to do what, and how are they elected, so there's election rules, how do we get each leader into office, and then there's other regulations that are listed, such as how are we going to provide education, how do we keep order, how do we build and care for highways, roads, and operate businesses, and then also how do we build revenue, which is through taxes. Then there's also the process of making amendments. So each state has its own set of amendments. And how are the laws going to be changed and regulated? And then I guess that's all I have to say about that. Thank you. So I keep mentioning how the state governments are pretty much a small version of our federal government's constitution. So there's those 4 main important basic principles that everyone should know that the federal government has and the state constitutions have. The 4 are popular sovereignty, meaning people control the government. Popular meaning of the people. The people have the power to elect the leaders. Separation of powers, meaning that each branch, the legislative, executive, and judicial, those 3 branches, have separate and definite powers, meaning their powers are defined, they're clear, they're articulated, and it keeps any branch from becoming too powerful. Checks and balances also is another form which each branch can check on the work of another branch. For instance, when the president, or not the president, we're talking about state, when the governor elects an official, their own version of Congress, the legislature, needs to approve who he elects. So that's a form of checks and balances. Other branches must sometimes approve certain actions and decisions, right? So the legislative branch has to also approve judges appointed by the executive branch, which is the governor leads the executive branch. So they have to approve the governor's selection of judges. And then there's limited government, which means state and federal officials must obey the law and the Constitution, ideally. Now, we don't always see that, but that's ideal. The government must never do anything to take away an individual's basic freedoms, as explained in the Bill of Rights. So what are shared and reserved powers? Well, reserved means to keep back for a special reason. The states keep some power for themselves. So the states can have some of their own power distinguished from the federal government. I created a little Venn diagram is what we call this. And where the 2 circles overlap is where they share power and responsibility. So where it's separate is where each group does its own thing. So the state government, as you notice, it establishes its own local government. It regulates trade within the state. It runs elections, it establishes schools, it licenses professional workers such as doctors and lawyers and teachers, and it also protects the lives and property of its people. And then the federal government, I'm just giving examples of what the federal government, as distinguished from states, can do. It can declare war, it can collect taxes, coin money, regulate currency, set standards of weights and measures, and that's more for international trade, so we have in common when we discuss the weight of something, of an item, of a product. It raises and maintains an army and a navy, and it has a right to found national banks or create national banks, and it regulates interstate commerce, meaning trade between states or business activities between states, such as California and Texas. Maybe they want to trade oil and peanuts, who knows. What they do share is they both can collect taxes, they both enforce laws, they both establish courts, they both borrow money. Health care and welfare are a part of their power, and they can both establish banks. Yeah, that's all. How do state laws affect people's daily lives? Well, they make most of the laws that really do affect people's daily lives. They decide laws that tell which actions are crimes. Their laws control guidelines for education, driving, and marriage. For instance, the California high school exit exam is a state mandate, meaning that in order for students to graduate from high school now, they have to pass the California high school exit exam, and that is a state responsibility. They also determine how government is set up and operated, and how large school districts will be, as each district has its own officials. Local governments are divided among counties, so we have county government officials, we have city government officials, and then there's terms such as township, village, parish. They are like counties, but so we don't hear parish too much in California because it's a local government in Louisiana, and the term borough also is a local government in Alaska. So if you ever hear those terms, just it means a smaller kind of local government. To your ability, go ahead and answer the following 7 questions. So we're going to talk about state budgets. Yes. Most state governments have budgets of more than $1 billion. So states need large amounts of money to provide services for citizens. And the states pay for schools and police protection, also road repair. So these services must be paid for by the state. Now, how they get their money is from income taxes, sales taxes, federal funds, and gasoline taxes. And the federal funds are just sums of money set aside for a special purpose. What is a personal income tax? Well, I think if you've been working, you've had money taken out of your paycheck, and so income taxes usually account for about 25% of the total money needed for a state. And believe it or not, some states do not collect income taxes. And then a sales tax is a source of income, and usually it's on goods that people buy. Sales taxes vary from state to state depending on the state's needs, and in many states they do not tax true necessities such as milk and bread, just because some families can't even afford that. So they'll usually tax items like gas, cigarettes, alcohol, and that's primarily where you'll find high taxes. How are federal funds given to states? Well, some money the federal government collects in taxes, and then federal funds vary from state to state, from year to year. So federal support to a state is often it's given in a form of what we call a grant, and a grant basically means you're supposed to spend the money in a certain way. So there are grants for the arts. There are grants for structural repair for buildings. So when the federal government gives a state money through grants, it means you have to use it in a specific way. It's not just free money. So you have to follow those guidelines. Let's see. There's also the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 requires that buildings are built that are built with federal funds provide access for people with disabilities. So you'll notice a lot of public buildings have ramps, things like that. What are the other sources of state income? Well, states usually collect other fees, and for instance, when you pay for your driver's license or when you pay for vehicle license plates and tags. There are also fees to record certain official papers, such as titles to property. And most businesses and many professionals pay fees to be licensed to perform their work in a state. So some states charge tolls also for using certain roads. If you've ever been to San Francisco, there's a toll for crossing the San Francisco Gate Bridge. Some states permit racing or lotteries and receive a percentage of the money that way. In fact, John Muir Charter School has received a very small amount, probably in our budget, $100, for lotteries because the people voted that a certain percentage should go to schools. So those are some ways to raise money. So what are some of the largest expenses for a state? Well, it's public education, but it's not what you think. It's for colleges. A very small amount goes towards primary and secondary education, meaning kindergarten through 12th grade. A very, very small amount is directed that way. Most of it goes in support of colleges and universities. And money also pays for new school buildings, education for people with disabilities who require special services, education for very young children. We call it Head Start, which is an excellent program that's been very successful, serving 3 to 5-year-olds, even younger than that. They have ones for even infants. And then also expenses go towards training people for new jobs and financial assistance for students. You can always apply for grants or financial aid, and states pay for that. Some facts about the schools. Schools operate on local tax money. So if that's how poverty strikes certain schools, is a school is placed in a neighborhood that's very poor, and so the tax that they get from that area is minimal, and so there's not much money for the general fund in order to buy books, to improve the school building, and to pay teachers well. So that's a discrepancy and an issue. Luckily in California, that's being changed and trying to make it more even in terms of distribution of revenue. So that there isn't this disparity, and pretty much the whole separate but equal clause starts to kick in. And it is untrue, separate is not equal. So states set up some rules for schools. Local school officials make most decisions, and then states decide how many school days there are, and they also decide the requirements for a teacher to meet certain educational standards. For instance, before I even went into the teaching program, I had to pass 2 major tests I paid for and passed. I spent a good $500, and then I was allowed in the teaching program, and then during that time I had to pass 3 more tests, and then something called BITSA, which is 2 years of more education, and then I had to return again for what they call a level 2. So those requirements are by the state. So let's go into more detail about the other expenses. Usually in most state budgets, though they vary, 15 to 20% of the budget goes towards building and maintaining highways, roads, and bridges. So taking care of our network of transportation. Some state expenses go into general administration, including salaries and benefits for state employees and maintenance of office buildings. The state police force provides protection in law enforcement. There's state police that assist in crime prevention. There's expenses in handling civil and criminal cases, so states have several prisons as well. States also have an expenditure on the National Guard, and which is necessary in case of emergencies like tornadoes, windstorms, threats of our safety. And then there's also the regulatory agencies that we once talked about. Well, states have these too, that provide rules for banks or insurance companies, and then also regulate public utilities like telephone, gas, and electric companies. So they watch over the safety standards and working conditions in factories and stores and mines. So these, again, the regulatory agencies that regulate. And that also has to do with state hospitals and nursing homes. There's regulations on how to care for people. The sale of medicine has guidelines that need to be overlooked, so that's an expense. Then lastly, there's parklands for people that need to be taken care of, although we have huge budget cuts in terms of maintenance of state parks. Some parks were closed. So each state has to make those decisions when we're in a deficit. And there's also expenses in health codes like food handling and children's health exams. So again, this is a general overview of the 6 main expenses. The main ones, so general administration salaries for state employees, because there are many. The state police force, courts handling civil cases and criminal cases, the National Guard to protect us in case of emergencies, the regulatory agencies that watch over the safety and hazards and well-being of the people, and lastly, the maintenance of parks for people, or to improve the existing parks. Now we're going to briefly go over the legislative branch of state government. So we're going to touch on each branch of government, which mimics very similarly. It's practically a spitting image of our federal government, although some things are very slightly different. The legislative branch in each state is the lawmaking body, so it works nearly the same as U.S. Congress. They pass laws, right? They legislate. There are 2 houses, just like the federal government, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Nebraska happens to be the only state that only has a House of Representatives, so that's unusual. And voters in each state elect members, so we get to vote for who they are, and so it's in districts, so you vote for the person in your district, right? So you're not voting for all the representatives, you're voting for the one that's representing your district. And it's divided according to population. And the House has similar districts as the Senate. However, the Senate has much less because there are less senators. The senators serve 4-year terms, and the representatives serve 2-year terms. Now, the federal government senators serve 6-year terms, so there is a difference there. So how does the legislatures work? Well, they start with a session. They meet once a year. So these lawmakers meet once a year. And that meeting time is called a session. And the governor or legislators can call an emergency session. Now, the government is in charge of the executive branch. I don't want you to get confused here. But both groups can call for an emergency. And so these sessions, after they meet, they form committees. All the members begin to shape into small groups or special task forces to do a particular job. For instance, maybe there's this one group that needs to talk about law in education, or another group that needs to focus on highways and courts. They have a lot that needs to get done, so they have these specialty committees. And then they start drafting bills or ideas for new laws, or they discuss previous ones, and they may rewrite or reject bills. And then when the bill is ready, they present it to the legislator, and the legislature needs to approve it. Okay, so this is very similar to our federal government. Each house, the state legislature has a presiding leader, meaning someone to stand in as a leader, or some kind of an official, and they conduct the meeting, so they keep order. So when they pick a leader, the leader appoints committees and their leaders, the leaders of the committees. The leader conducts meetings or sessions for that part of the legislature. Well, the House of Representatives can elect a leader or a speaker. And in most states, the state senators choose the leader of the Senate. In other states, the lieutenant governor is the leader for the Senate. So the lieutenant governor is much like a vice president. So it's similar in being a head of the Senate. If the lieutenant governor cannot attend, then members elect a temporary president. So here's the organization of an example of a state government. It's not always ordered, but as you see on the top, the three branches are listed. There's the legislative branch, broken into two parts, Senate and Assembly. Then there's the executive branch, and then the governor is similar to that of a president, leading the executive branch, the one that executes the laws. Then there's the judicial branch, and it's broken into the three main courts: the Supreme Court, which is the top court of the state, the Superior Court, and then the tax court. And then, as you can see under the governor in the executive branch, just like the cabinet, there are departments in a state government. And so you can see these different departments that focus on particular issues, for instance, health or human services, such as social services. So I know you're dying to know, how are state laws created? How? Well, much like our federal government, they introduce a bill. And then the committee, you know how it's broken up into certain committees, they receive the bill. And the committee can decide to amend, meaning change or alter, or rewrite the entire bill. So these specialized committees will look at, say, for instance, there's a bill on highway maintenance, and they're looking at it and they're adding some things, taking some things away. Well, then they present it to the members of the House where it was originally introduced. So it goes back to the House, and then they decide to vote. They make if there's a majority vote in favor of it, it's approved and sent to the other house, right? Because there's two houses. There's the Senate and the House of Representatives. So if it started in the Senate, it would go then to the House of Representatives. And the same steps follow. The House of Representatives, for instance, would look at it, and they have a committee that reviews and rewrites it. And then it goes back to their own group, their own house, and if it's approved there, shoo, it goes bam to the governor. And then it's up to the governor to sign it or veto it and send it back. Okay? If the governor signs it, cha-chang, it becomes a law. If not, if it's not approved and it's vetoed, the legislature can override or reject the veto. But it takes a 2/3 vote. So the executive branch of the state government involves the governor. In the California's 39th governor right now is Jerry Brown. He once was governor back in the 70s, believe it or not, and he is responsible for starting the California Conservation Corps. So the governor, it kind of mimics what the president does for the United States, and they head the executive branch to execute, to do, right? So they follow along what the legislature has created, and then they execute. So this branch is made up of agencies, and the governor is the chief executive and has duties that oversee the agencies. Okay, so the governor can appoint heads of departments, and remember in that prior slide there were all these little departments, and then he or she can drop a state budget. They act as commander-in-chief of the National Guard. Okay, so if there's an emergency, you can count on the governor to call in the National Guard for help. If there's a flood or a hurricane or there's some kind of crazy violent riot breaking out, the National Guard will respond. And then the governor also can suggest bills to the legislature and has the power to appoint judges, although the legislature has to approve. And then, believe it or not, the governor can shorten a prison sentence for someone or have a prisoner released or pardoned from a crime in certain cases. So there are other state officials that you need to be somewhat familiar with. So there's the lieutenant governor, who is the second most important state official. They are usually, in most states, elected by the people. So that's like a vice president, but it's called the lieutenant governor. Then there's the attorney general, who is the chief legal officer in the state. So they advise in regarding legal matters and helping us understand more what the law is. So the attorney general is has a very important role. And then there's the Secretary of State, who tracks all our official records, publishes laws that are made so that we all can read them, and also oversees the official business. Number 4, the comptroller or state auditor. They collect taxes, so that's our revenue for our state, and also pays bills that we owe. And last, the superintendent of public instruction is the top educational official. So I sometimes get notices sent out by the superintendent in new laws that need to be made and followed. So they work with the Board of Education and carry out these laws, and they set qualifications for teachers in the state. So I'm constantly having to go back to school to meet these new qualifications and standards like any other teacher. Okay, finally we're going to close it out, and then you'll have your review with the Judicial Branch. Now, the Judicial Branch has state courts, and they follow the same principles as the federal courts. So cases are divided into civil or criminal cases. So the civil cases deal with disputes between people. So it's not really about a crime being broke, but dealing with conflict between civilians. And then there's the criminal cases. And those cases deal with violations of state law. And that means it could be a felony or a misdemeanor. And then there's the Supreme Court, which is the overriding court of all courts. And they deal mostly with appeals from these two lower courts. Okay, the two lower cases, for instance, a civil case or a criminal case, could be appealed in a state court and brought to the state Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court does not hear new evidence. They do not hear anything different. What they do is they review the evidence that's already been in place. They don't have a new trial. They determine if the trial was fair. So they're actually looking at the preceding trial from a lower court. There's juvenile courts, domestic relations courts, and small claims courts, and municipal courts, and probate courts. All those courts, something could happen where they would want the Supreme Court to review or deal with an appeal from those courts if the person convicted was unhappy with the sentence or with the outcome more so.